John Searle, you have strong views on the subject of artificial intelligence, and I think those views focus on one argument.
Yeah.
And it's something about a Chinese room.
Well, let me tell you a little bit.
I wonder if you would tell me what it aims to prove and then tell me what it is.
Okay. I like to talk about particular programs and the sort of thing that's claimed for them. So let's take as an example the Yale program at the Yale Artificial Intelligence Lab for understanding stories. That's understanding it in quotes. The way it works is this. You give the computer a story. These tend to be rather simple-minded stories. Here's a story. Man went into a restaurant and ordered a hamburger. When they brought him the hamburger, it was burned to a crisp. So the man stormed out of the restaurant without paying the bill. Now you ask the computer, did the man eat the hamburger? And lo and behold, the computer says, no, he didn't eat the hamburger. Now, that's an interesting result because you remember it didn't say in the story whether or not the guy ate the hamburger.
One up for the computer.
One up for the computer. Okay, now, and that's presumably doing something we could do. That is passing the test that we would test, but we would expect a child to pass for understanding the story. Okay, how does it work? Well, the computer has in its data bank, in addition to the story, it's got a representation of how things go on in restaurants called a restaurant script. And it matches the story and the question against the restaurant script before it gives the answer. Now, what are we to make of this? Well, what I call the strong AI people, and I'm really not sure Maggie is one of them, but the people who are sort of the gung-ho fanatics in AI say, this proves that the computer literally understands the story. Now, I think I can demonstrate conclusively that it proves no such thing, and in fact that the computer doesn't understand the story.
Here's how it goes. Is that understanding without inverted
No
commas?
quotes here. I mean,
no kind of funny
honest to John understanding. Right. I mean, and to their credit, a lot of people in AI insist that we are using these words in their literal sense. Simon and Newell say the understanding we attribute to the computer is the same understanding we attribute to human beings. Okay, what I ask you to imagine is this. I like to do it in the first person and have everybody do it from their own point of view. Imagine I'm locked in a room and I got a huge box full of Chinese symbols. I don't know any Chinese, just so many squiggle signs to me. Now they bring in another box full of Chinese symbols and they give me a bunch of rules in English for matching these symbols. So it says, take a squiggle sign out of box number 1 and go and put it next to a squaggle sign out of box number 2. Just to jump ahead a second, that's called a computational rule over formally specified elements. Okay, now let's suppose they give me in another little batch of Chinese symbols together with some more rules in English for shuffling these symbols around. Only this time I give them back, the chaps who are giving me all this stuff through the window, I give them back some Chinese symbols. So here I am in my room with my 3 bunches of Chinese symbols. I'm shuffling symbols around. Symbols are coming in and I'm shuffling them back out. Now imagine, unknown to me, the guys who gave me the first box call it a restaurant script. The second box, they call a story about a restaurant. The third bunch of symbols, they call questions about the story. The rules in English, they call the program. The answer, the stuff that I give them back through the window, they call answers to the questions about the story. And me, they call the computer. Now, let's suppose that after a while, they get so good at writing the program, and I get so good at shuffling symbols, that my answers to the questions are indistinguishable from native Chinese speakers. So the story comes in, I don't know what it means, just a bunch of symbols. But the question follows, did the guy in the restaurant eat the egg foo young? And I give back the symbol that means, no, the guy didn't eat the egg foo young. Now, I pass the test for understanding the story, but I don't understand a word of Chinese.
I think that is the Turing test.
That's so-called Turing test.
Could you say a word about that?
Well, Alan Turing, a great British mathematical genius, invented the test for determining whether or not we should attribute understanding to the computer, and the test was, could the computer fool an expert? So let's suppose that I can fool the experts. My answers to the questions are as good as those of native Chinese speakers. Imagine they even give me a question of the form, do you understand Chinese? And I give them back answers that mean in Chinese, of course I understand Chinese. Why do you guys keep asking me these stupid questions? Can't you see I'm passing the Turing test? Now, here's the punchline. This is the point of the whole analysis. I do not understand a word of Chinese. And if I don't understand Chinese in this example, neither does any computer, because the computer has exactly what I have. The computer has that and nothing more. It has a set of formal rules for manipulating symbols. It takes symbols as input, it manipulates the symbols, it gives symbols as output. And if I don't understand Chinese, which I obviously don't, there's no way any other digital computer could understand Chinese or anything else, because all it has is uninterpreted formal symbols. Or just to put this again in one last sentence, and that is what the computer has, and Maggie described this very well with the programs, is a syntax and not a semantics. What it's got is a set of formal rules for manipulating uninterpreted formal symbols. But what human beings have is not just a bunch of symbols. We know what the symbols mean. You give me a story in English and I know what it means.
So what the computer has is rules for putting terms together, but no rules specifying what terms stand for, something like that.
And furthermore, it couldn't, because suppose you tried to give a...
I guess one thing is I do feel like he went over what the Turing test is like so quickly that it would be easy to blink and miss it. So this is funny, actually. I remember like 9 years ago, I think there was a Hollywood movie that came out about Alan Turing called The Imitation Game, which the name of the movie is a reference to the Turing test, but they never actually say anything about the Turing test in the movie. It doesn't come up in the movie, which I can only assume that it was, part of some original script that ended up getting cut, and they just kept the name of the movie, or in some incredibly subtle way that I missed. You were supposed to get it out of the movie or something. But it is interesting because if people who know a little bit about Turing, may know that. He's one of the people who's most responsible for the sort of foundations of computer science. Computers as we know them today. He was was a code breaker in World War II, helped defeat the Nazis, and then he was, to simplify a little bit, essentially murdered by the British government by sort of forcing him to take medication that I think ended up leading him to become suicidal, to de-gay him, because it was like the late 40s or early 50s and people thought that worked. But in the all of which I'm just saying because it contributes to why this would actually have been interesting if in the movie that included something about the test, because the original paper that he wrote, I remember reading that Minds and Machines class back in 2002, whenever that was, had the way it starts out. It's like the original Imitation Game that was the inspiration for the Turing test was apparently some sort of like weird British aristocratic party game where like they'd have somebody who was in a room, or two people in a room, maybe one was a man and one was a woman, and they would have questions passed into them and they would pass out answers. And I think they were supposed to use typewriters, so you couldn't tell by the handwriting. You were supposed to guess who was the man and who was the woman. And he said if people fail, if people weren't able to identify whether they were talking to a computer or a human as often as they were unable to identify whether they were talking to a man or a woman, then we would could safely conclude that the computers could really think. That's more or less what the Turing test is.
I didn't know that it came from a game. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Whose cat is that, by the way? Is that?
Oh, that's my cat. He's
because I know Ethan has one too. So
yeah, I'm pretty sure that's Shabazz though. He doesn't. I mean, whatever. I mean, if he does need anything, Jen can deal with it. But I seriously doubt he needs anything. He just sometimes he just likes to wander around meowing.
Yeah, for sure. On the Turing test, this is like slightly off topic, but I think I was thinking about it recently. Are you familiar with like the ideological Turing test? Because I think that's like an interesting good faith.
No.
I forget who invented it. I mean, I don't know if Ethan knows, but like the whole idea is like, if you pass the ideological Turing test, if you can like say back to your like debate opponent or your like political or ideological adversary, if you can say back to them like their own position that they accept in a way that they would be like, yes, that's correct. If you can kind of blend in, if you can go and hang out with libertarians, for example, and they can't tell that you're not one of them because you're saying all the right things and you're saying it charitably in the way that they would say it, right? Then you're passing the ideological Turing test.
That's interesting. I feel like I might be able to do that with libertarians. I feel like I would absolutely be unable to do that if I was like hanging out with like Sora Bramari and Patrick Deneen and I had to pretend to be like a Catholic integralist, like
Yeah.
I am 100% sure that I wouldn't be able to pass the test.
Yeah, that would be a hard test to pass for sure.
Yeah. So anyway, okay. So he's given the basic thing. I don't know if this is going to come up later in the debate, or I don't even know how much of a debate this ends up being at this point. Although it does sound like it should be a little bit of a one, because she did say in passing that she does think strong AI is possible in principle. So maybe there is like a fundamental disagreement there. Although honestly I think Searle is slightly slippery about whether he's saying that there can't be, or just that like the Turing test wouldn't tell you that you achieved it. Because he does say, I remember someplace like, well, look, there's nothing about like silicon that like necessarily means that it couldn't be conscious, but or I don't know, maybe he doesn't say that about silicon. He definitely says
he does. I think
he does. Okay,
he does, but I think his point is more like the material maybe doesn't matter. It's more just like the method of using computation and symbol manipulation. Like it doesn't matter what you do, but then I think he likes to say like, but I'm not. He's like, I'm a materialist. So like, I do think that you could probably make an artificial brain one day. Like, I don't see why you couldn't, assuming that like the human being is a machine and the brain is a machine of some kind. He's like, we can maybe make a brain. Maybe it could be out of silicon, but he's just like, as long as you're using the kind of computational paradigm, he's like, in principle, it would be impossible, I think is his view.
Sorry,
sorry, go ahead.
Can you say those last like two sentences again, Victor? I just want to make sure I got it.
Oh, like so he's just saying like he's a materialist, so he thinks that like you could in principle make an artificial brain. He's just like, we have no idea how to do it right now. Right. He's like we just have no idea how the brain works, but he's like, in principle, if you accept that the human being is a machine and the brain is a machine, well, in principle you can make that machine some other way. He's like, but as long as you're using the paradigm of computation, which is using symbol manipulation, in principle, it's impossible to get consciousness from that, he thinks.
Gotcha. Yeah, that does sound very familiar. Ethan, what were you saying?
I wonder if what John Searle thinks about Boden's point about, it was interesting because based on how she started it, I thought that I was going to have more contention with Searle, but then she went on to make this claim about machine minds, even if existing, like wouldn't matter morally. I wonder what Searle thinks about, because I can't think of like, it almost takes me back to like Peter Singer's argument for like animals mattering. It's like, in virtue of what trait are you going to say like all humans are valuable, right? Because humans have different levels of like intelligence, different physical capacities. It seems like the only way you can say all humans are of equal value is if you value them based on like their subjectivity and their consciousness. But then like, how are you going to bar machines or animals from moral consideration? It's not clear to me.
Yeah, that was weird.
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, like especially because the way she said it was like naturally evolved creatures matter more. It's like, well, why should that matter morally? That's a moral distinction.
Yeah.
It's like you didn't like you sort of imagine some like conscious robot in a science fiction story that's like feels pain and stuff, and you're like, sorry.
Yeah. Or like, have you seen the movie Prometheus?
Yeah, I have.
Unfortunately, yes.
I think didn't it turn out at the end of that movie that humans were like the product of some like weird god creature like planting a seed? Like, so it seems like on her view, right? Like we would end up just not mattering if that turned out to be the case.
Well, actually, the really fun thing about her view is that if creationism was true, then we wouldn't matter. Right? Like we're just lucky that we evolved. That it's if we had been intelligently designed, we wouldn't be morally significant.
Right. That's funny.
I like it. All right, let's keep watching.
The computer an interpretation of the story. So you feed in more symbols that say in Chinese, the symbol for egg foo young means a certain kind of egg dish made by putting in a whole lot of soy sauce when you cook the eggs. Well, there's no
Right.
way that the computer can know any of that, because what it gets is just more symbols. That is, any effort to give an interpretation of the symbols results only in more symbols, and that's
Right.
by definition what a program is.
Right. Professor Boden, that argument, as you know, has enraged a lot of people. I wonder if it enrages you.
It enrages me a bit too. You shifted, John, from talking about a specific example, the Yale program with the restaurant script and the hamburger, to talking about any computer. Now, I think that was a bit naughty, because if you stayed talking just about Shank's program, I entirely agree with you. These things do just shift symbols around. They've got no sense of what a restaurant is or a hamburger or anything else. I entirely agree. But then I think there are two things that you would need to add to that sort of program to get a program which was much nearer to having genuine meaning, genuine intentionality. One is, as you said yourself, you've got to have some semantics plugged in. Now, how are you going to do that? I agree you cannot do it in principle purely by adding more formal rules, which by definition aren't interpreted in terms of things in the real world. And I think that you've got to have some causal relationship built into the computer, just as it's built into our brain, into our retina, whatever, in order to establish the semantics, in order to establish the reference. And you've not only got to have sense organs, if you like, taking information in causal commerce with the world, you've also got to have the thing, manipulating things. So if it doesn't, if the egg foo young has a certain chemical in it, it will spit it out, so forth as we do. Now, if you say that reply isn't really very clear because there's all sorts of questions, all sorts of problems you could raise about whether I really have plugged semantics in, I would say you're absolutely right. But then I would say we don't understand from the philosophical point of view clearly what semantics is in the human case. We don't understand what it is for you or me to refer to that glass. So to be fair, we shouldn't ask for a clearer account of semantics in the AI case than we ask for in the human case. That's the first point I'd make. The second point is that I also think there's a little bit of a sleight of hand when you talk in this dismissive way about shuffling symbols. You imagine this man having the table with, you look up squiggle, squiggle, and he looks across and he finds squoggle, great, squoggle, squoggle goes in this box and out of the window. Even the programs that Yale have at the moment, and as I said before, those are absolutely minute and paltry compared with anything that would have genuine psychological interest in explaining what understanding might be. Even his programs are much, much more complex than that. And not only much more complex, but they involve a wide range of sorts of internal representations which model, if you like, and we'll put all the scare quotes on, okay, things like beliefs, desires, intentions of the person who's listening to the story and emotionally reacting to it, of the various characters in the story. And anything which is going to be a candidate for being the same sort of thing as a human mind has got to have all that. So I entirely agree that his program doesn't have any sort of semantics, but I'd like to know what you'd say about the programs of people like David Marr or Geoffrey Hinton, which are programs, basically they're visual programs, and the point of interest here about them is that they're built in what's called dedicated machines. That's to say they're built in machines which, like the retina of our eye, has got special little bits in them which react to the light coming in a certain way, so that they can suss out what the three-dimensional shape of something like this is, given that they're only getting a two-dimensional image in. Now, what would you say about that?
Well, let's take both of these points. First of all, the point about complexity. It seems to me my argument has nothing to do with the simplicity or the complexity of the program, because the point is a perfectly general point. The point is that however simple or complex the program is, in order that it be a computer program, it has to be defined purely formally. The whole appeal of artificial intelligence, and indeed the power of computer science, is that one and the same program can be instantiated in an indefinite range of different kinds of hardware, precisely because it is defined purely formally. So I would say, as far as the Chinese room is concerned, make the program as complicated as you like. Put in as many representations of as many facts about the world as you like, and the argument remain exactly the same. I still don't know any Chinese because in the way that the system is set up, I have no way of attaching any meaning to the elements in the program, to the symbols that the program operates over, regardless of how complex the program is. So I think the issue of complexity is a red herring, but I don't think that's your main argument. Your main argument, if I understand you correctly, is it's causation plus the program that gives us the mind. Now, I already want to say that is an abandonment of AI as it's traditionally conceived, because now we're not saying the mind is a program. Mind is to brain as program is to hardware. What we're saying is it's program plus causation. So let me consider that, if I may, for a couple of minutes.
Is it causation on the way into the computer or causation on the way out?
The way Maggie had it, I listened very carefully, the way
Right.
Maggie had it is both. And I think that's a more powerful, that's the argument I'd like to challenge, because that's a more powerful argument.
So if you had a computer with a good program attached to a robot,
Right.
and it was causally affected by the environment, and in turn acted causally so that it behaved,
Right.
then on Professor Boden's view, it would understand in inverted commas, and on your view, it would be nowhere near it. Is
That's
that it?
right. Let me go through what I think would be the strongest version of Maggie's case. Imagine a robot, and it's got television cameras attached to its eyes, and it's got a motor apparatus attached to the computer in its skull, and it takes in visual stimuli, and let it use the MAR program to process the visual stimuli. It goes through the primal sketch and all of those things, and then it has motor output based on the set of interfaces between the sensory input and the motor output. In short, the way we've described it is much like the way a lot of people who believe in the computer theory of the brain describe the way that our brain mediates sensory inputs and motor outputs. Okay, I want to say the Chinese room applies exactly to that case. Imagine that in this robot, there's a big room in the robot's skull, and I am in that room. And what comes into me from these television sets are a lot of Chinese symbols. And I have no idea where they come from. I'm just paid to sit in this room and follow the instructions and shuffle the symbols around. Now, I then pass back certain symbols or put them in the appropriate slots and push the appropriate buttons. And unknown to me, what I'm doing is mediating the sensory input to a motor output. But all the same, what I have is what any digital computer has. Formal symbols, uninterpreted, and you can give them any causation you like. As long as there's no mental representation of that causal relationship, they give me no way of attaching any meaning to the symbols. So let's take an actual case here. Here I am, and I am the robot's brain now, or I'm, if you like, its homunculus. And the robot eats egg foo young at this point, and a symbol comes into me that means egg foo young. Unless I have some way of knowing the causal history of that symbol, that is, unless I have some mental representation of the causal relationship, I still don't learn any meanings of any words. That is, as long as the form of causation isn't mental causation, that is, as long as it's just ordinary physical causation, it won't give me the meanings of any symbols.
Well,
Meanings seem to be the crux here.
Yes, can I make two responses to that, John? The first is that you've weakened your homunculus. In the story that you just told us, you aren't the robot. You aren't even the robot's brain. You are a subsystem in the robot's brain. Now, there are lots of subsystems in our brain, lots of distinguishable psychological processes which are used, for example, in understanding a sentence or even in working out what the syntax of the sentence is. Now, nobody would want to claim, I think, that one of those processes actually understood what syntax was in the sense in which you and I, as human beings, understand it. So that you cannot cheat by cutting off the semantics, by ignoring the fact that there are these causal relationships with the outside world with this robot, and having a truncated homunculus where you've deliberately, got rid of the semantics. That's the first thing I'd say. And the second thing I'd say is that when we talk about causation here, it's very important to realize that there are two sorts of causation that we need. One, which we need to get the meaning in, is the plugging into the world, the causal commerce with the world in the way that we just talked about, what you might call pure physical causation. That light comes into my eyes, makes things happen on my retina, and that this body in the world touches that and it moves in physical space. Okay, but in between that, there is psychological causation, what you call mental causation. Now, I would want to say that that psychological causation is best understood as a series of computations which ultimately are anchored in processes with a genuine causal semantics, if you like, of the sort that I've been mentioning. But when Ma, for example, talks about vision, he doesn't just talk about the way in which the light affects the cells in the retina. He then goes on, as you know, to talk about a number of different levels of representation in the visual system, which are needed even just to work out something simple as what is the three-dimensional shape of that glass. And each of those levels of representation is defined by him very carefully in terms of a set of symbols, which might conceivably have been different, and each of which is defined in terms of the more primitive symbols at the level below. And ultimately, of course, you've got the level at which the eye is actually functioning as a physical transducer, namely, you've got a plugging in of your semantics causally into the world. But we mustn't forget that there's physical causation in that sense, which is crucial, but there's also mental, or I would prefer to say computational causation.
The crucial point in my analysis is that since the formal computer program has no semantic or mental content by definition, then any artificial system that is supposed to give it mental content will have to do something which is equivalent to what the human brain does.
Yes.
Now, that's because that's what the human brain does.
Right.
But on the way that you've described it, and incidentally, in my reading, for example, I was supposed to be the whole brain. That is, it isn't that there are a whole lot of other brains in there. I am the entire brain. I do all the MAR processing as well as other sorts of processing. Now, on that way of describing it, there is no way that the causation plus the symbols could produce any mental content, because there's nothing in the system that performs functions equivalent to those of the human brain. Now, let me take these two propositions, because they are crucial to the argument. We got one out at the beginning, namely, syntax is not semantics. The syntax of the program by itself doesn't give us semantics.
Right.
Now, the second proposition, which is implicit in my account, is brains do it. Brains cause minds. Now, if you take those two together, then we know that the way that the brain does it can't be solely manipulating syntax, because that the syntax isn't enough by itself. Now, what you suggested is, well, let's add causation to the syntax, and that way we'll get what the brain does. But the answer to that is, the only way it would do it would be if you added something that was more than what any digital computer has, namely something that was biochemically the functional equivalent of the human brain.
Good place to stop.
Yeah, I have some thoughts, but I'm curious about what you guys think about the back and forth so far.
Yeah, I mean, I'm enjoying it. I think there's a couple things. It seems like the like main kind of point of disagreement is like what exactly constitutes semantics or like meaning or like and I think she raised kind of an interesting question about the fact that he wasn't exactly at the beginning, at least, defining what that means. But ultimately, I mean, I'm remaining sympathetic, I think, to Searle here.
Yeah. Well, actually, let's hear from Ethan first.
Yeah, I think I'm more sympathetic to Searle's view than I thought I would be when we first started the debate. Because I originally took his position to be, you know, like minds can only be in the types of organisms that we are, but it seems his argument's more like, given the framework of, you know, how computation works, you can't have a mind in a program that's basically just manipulating symbols according to certain specified rules. Yeah, I think I'm pretty sympathetic to that view. Although a lot of what they're talking about, like we started out in philosophy of mind, which is like a subject I don't know as much about, and now we're getting into like meaning and semantics, which I know even less about. So I'm trying my best to follow along, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my sense so far is that I sort of feel like Boden kind of has the better of him on some of these specific arguments. Like I think she's like giving the like really sharp responses, but there's still something that he's like putting his finger on. that like bothers me. And you know, and like there still seems like there's something there. I mean, I think that you know, yeah, I mean, there is something very intuitive about his perspective about all this. I do think, you know, I do think that, put this, like, I do think that one thing that seems like she's been pushing in a lot of her responses, which is like a really good response to Searle, I think, is, okay, if you just describe symbol manipulation, then it's very easy to sort of get the intuition that's like, okay, well, that's obviously something different from you know, semantics, understanding, consciousness, whatever, which are, you know, maybe different concepts, but I mean, like, just for our purposes right now, we can just lump them all together like Searle is. Like, but then, and you say, oh, well, see, computers are only doing that thing, therefore it's not consciousness, and brains are doing something else. But then, like, the obvious follow-up question is, okay, great, what's the something else that the brains are doing? Like, once you kind of nail that down, then, like, we'll have a better idea of whether we can get computers to do them. And I think that Searle doesn't have a great response to that in his back pocket. I mean, like he sort of says, well, brains are interpreting the symbols in ways that give them semantic or mental content or whatever. But, like, okay, so what would it be? You know, what is the extra thing besides symbol manipulation and causation that allows brains to do that? And if the answer is then, you know, then I don't. It's really hard to know where to go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think he at the end, and I think someone in the chat pointed this out, he just ends up kind of appealing to biochemical processes, right? Like, and you know, I think I agree that that's like a
photosynthesis. I remember that from reading Searle many years ago. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, he does talk about that. I think, and I think like
photosynthesis, it's a biochemical process.
Yes, exactly. So he appeals to that, but like I think both kind of like the strength and maybe weakness of his view is that like his view kind of depends on the idea that like, well, we don't really know how the brain works yet, right? So like, but he's like, but in principle, it doesn't seem to me that it's anything magical. We just don't know how it works yet. It's like, that's a good thing. But I agree, it also leaves the door open. Well, then what's this extra thing that the brain is doing if it's not symbol manipulation? I think for him, also part of it, which I don't know if it's going to come up in this debate, is just like that by accepting that symbol manipulation is sufficient for some kind of consciousness, then you accept a whole bunch of other ideas that I think he finds unacceptable, like the idea that consciousness, if it's just a program that is symbol manipulation, then presumably you could produce consciousness on, you know, anything that is just manipulating symbols, right? You can make, I think I've heard him say something like, oh, you could do like a bunch of beer cans that are like put together to run in a program that bang into each other, that then isn't somehow connected electrically to then you could create consciousness on that, right? So I think he might, hopefully he'll like kind of talk about that, but yeah, it just kind of leads you down this road where you're like, okay, well, literally anything could be conscious then.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of like, yeah. So as much as I'm sort of uncomfortable with the racial politics of all these examples made about China. There's also something called the Chinese nation thought experiment, which is like, could like some vast group of people, like the entire nation of China, if they arrange themselves in certain complex ways to relay messages and stuff, would that become like a collective consciousness? And if you think that that's wrong, then you should think that like mere complexity isn't good enough. I think. I mean, I might be getting this slightly wrong, but I think that's the point of that example.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think you're right. Yeah, like that's a good example of kind of what I was talking about. Well, like, because if you have like a coordination of people to like run the program the exact same way that a computer is running that program, then that you would have to accept that that's conscious if you accept the computational view.
Yeah,
which seems very unintuitive.
Yeah. Off topic, but Charles says, by the way, am I the only one drowning in Warnock emails and texts? My brother, you are not. I voted for the guy. I am going to vote for him. on the second round, when the runoff happens, but like every single day I block a few of those numbers on my phone.
Oh yeah, you guys I guess you both must be in Georgia. I mean, I'm definitely not getting any of those up here in Canada.
Yeah, you're not getting them up in Canada, but I think plenty of people who don't live in
Are
Georgia are probably still getting like fundraising stuff.
Are you getting any, Ethan?
No, I still get. It's weird because I don't even remember like linking my email or anything in any context. I get a lot of emails from Elizabeth Warren, and I swear to God, last time I checked my email, or one of the last times I checked my email, which is rare, I just see an email from Elizabeth Warren that says like, "I wish I could have called my daddy today," and I'm like, well, I don't know what this. I don't know what these
Liz,
emails
we
are
don't have
about.
this kind of relationship. You can yeah. No, I was. Yeah, my favorite fake ones were the messages from Nancy Pelosi. It's like, God damn, Nancy, I keep blocking your numbers. You got to stop. But I guess now it'll be Hakeem Jeffries. But
I was gonna. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, kind of back to the Searle debate. I wanted to mention as well that I know that like one of the famous responses, and maybe he'll talk about it here, like to the whole Chinese room thing, is some people will say, well, oh, of course, like the symbol and manipulator isn't conscious, but the whole room is conscious, right? Like that it's like somehow there's an emergent. So a lot of people like to respond.
Yeah, the entire system is conscious.
Exactly. They try to have some kind of an emergent property argument that it's like the consciousness emerges from, which doesn't really seem very intuitive to me, but I get the impulse in a way.
Yeah, I mean, which is kind of what, I mean, even though she didn't put it in exactly those terms, that does seem like what Boden was pushing with a lot of the exchange just now. That she says, well, okay, like when you're talking about these like very simple computational systems, then it seems unreasonable to say they're conscious. But like this is the kind of idea that people have, that it like this is somehow emerges at a sufficient level of complexity or something. Which, I mean, I think is both sort of intuitive, like it does seem less ridiculous when you get up to a sufficient level of complexity, but then like you think about it from a different angle, it's like, wait a second, why should that matter, right? Like that's, but I will say that in his explanation of the homunculus and all of that, it that did, I think, feel very prone to that, because it's like that did, and I think she called him on this correctly, like that did kind of sound more like we're imagining something that's like much more within the brain than even the whole brain, that like it really did sound like he was describing like one part of a cognitive system. So it's like, yeah, sure, that thing doesn't understand Chinese or whatever, but like, is that really like, I mean, this is so like in terms of this sort of like deflating the intuitive punch of the Chinese room, I think the idea that there's something about the guy in the room that's like dissimilar from like a whole person who would speak Chinese, and that therefore maybe if we're thinking about, the AI in a larger context, or the AI embedded in the right kind of physical system or something, to be more like a person understanding Chinese and less like some sort of module in the Chinese speaker's brain. I mean, I think like at least sort of rhetorically, that's a good strategy. I'm not sure how convincing I really find it or not. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.